Chapter 1. Danny Gumbo's big hands began to tremble with excitement, so he knew he'd better rest a moment. He sat back on the edge of the lower bunk and dribbled a little Duke's mixture onto a brown paper and twisted the ends. In the adjacent cell, a phonograph wailed something about a Japanese Sandman. Gumbo grinned crookedly. A swell piece to be playing these days. But the poor old prisoner didn't know any better. He'd been locked up so long he was stir-simple. Anyway, you don't worry about such trivia as war in San Jacinto Penitentiary. You thought only of escape, if you could still think at all. Gumbo laid his cigarette on the rim of the wash basin and went back to his task. He had made an ingenious cutting tool of a diamond day from a coffin, claimed by a two-tipped phonograph needle, a nail, and a piece of string. One end of the string was attached to the nail, which Gumbo held steadily in a tiny pit in the iron door of his cell. The hard-tipped needle was tied to the other end of the string, about 3 inches from the nail. By revolving the needle against the door, Gumbo had tediously cut a 6-inch circle in the metal near the lock. It was hard work, and it took time, but in the past 7 weeks he had almost penetrated the door. When the prisoner's phonograph stopped, Gumbo stopped. He made a dun-colored paste of water and floor dust and plugged the cut. His hands started to shake again. Bo Jenkins, his cellmate, lowered the confession magazine he was reading and leaned out of the upper bunk. "Don't you get enough, Gumbo?" Gumbo secreted his implement behind a pipe. "I'm through, Bo," he said softly. "Through? I can punch it out with my fist." He took a restless turn around the cell and picked up his half-smoked butt. Bo made a sighing noise through his false teeth. He was a thin, dried-out little man in his 60s, with sunken cheeks from going without a plate for too long, and wiry snow-white brows. His eyes were bad, and constant squinting had puckered the skin around them. At one time he had been tops in the engraving racket. But when the federal men began to recognize his handiwork and salted him away on a counterfeiting rap, he turned to forgery on his release. After a few lush seasons, however, his eyes began to trouble him. He muffed a few good takes and did another jolt. He dropped down the scale to writing checks. He made a killing in that too, and kited enough wallpaper from Seattle to Miami to retire. But somehow it had slipped through his fingers, and when he was nailed in California, his prior convictions finished him. A tough DA set him up for life under the habitual criminal law. Now, resigned to the inevitable, he spent his time studying the fate of girls gone wrong. He avoided Gumbo's eyes and rustled the magazine in his hand. "This woman now, she fell for a married man, and he was the wrong one." Gumbo jerked the tattered magazine from the old man's hand and tossed it on the table. "Forget women. Talk to me. Didn't you hear me say I was through?" Bo sidled out of his bunk like a tired spider and sat with Gumbo on the lower one. Gumbo built him a smoke. "I don't want to talk about it," whined the old convict. "You're crazy, Gumbo. The guards will blow you in half before you get out of this block. If you do make it out to the yard, the gun bulls in the tower will get you. Listen, boy, you ain't got a chance in a million. God Almighty, I've seen more than a dozen kids chopped down in my time." Gumbo laughed and clapped the old man on the leg. "We've been all over that, Bo. 4 years has been too long. 4 more, and I'll be as stir-simple as the rest of these in here." He cocked his head, listening for the cat-footed tread of the guard, and then went on. "I'll make it tonight when they change shifts at midnight. The fresh bulls won't have time to get their eyes used to the darkness. I'll make it. It's you I'm worried about, Bo. Come with me." Bo wagged his head. "Ha! Not me, kid. Not a chance. I wouldn't go if I was sure we could cut it." "Why?" "Well, lots of reasons. In the first place, I can't swim enough to buck them currents to the mainland. But that ain't it. Look, I know what it's like to be hunted. You don't. You lie out in the rain, hungry, cold, scared of the sound of your own heart pounding. You can't trust nobody. Then there's always a woman. Why, I was just reading about a woman who—" "Never mind that," Bo interrupted. "Remember this. Whether I make it out or not, they'll take it out on you." "So what?" "I don't want it that way," Bo shrugged. "There ain't no choice. I'm not rat enough to squeal, and I can't talk you out of it." "No, you can't talk me out of it." "Okay, so I get 30 days in the hole. On bread and water. I've done it before, and I'll do it again. That don't worry me." "Well, it worries me," Gumbo grumbled. "I don't like it. I've got a swell angle when we get out of here. There's a certain guy, A big shot who'll be tickled, Bo stopped him. Nix! I don't want to know nothing about it, boy. What I don't hear, I can't repeat. Gumbo knew the futility of the argument with the old man, so he gave up. He rose and studied his own reflection in the wavy mirror above the washstand. Tell me, on the level, Bo, have I changed much since I was thrown into this hell 4 years ago? Bo wiped his watery eyes and angled for a better look. Yep, you're different, Gumbo, he temporized. Maybe for the better, I don't know. You was a nice, scrawny, wide-eyed kid who talked too much. How old are you, son? 23. No kiddin'. Geez, you look 10 years older than that now. You hardened, kid, inside and out. I hates to see a lad get hard. It shows in his eyes most. It's a look the bulls and coppers spot first. You're marked, Gumbo. Gumbo stared at his image. It'll wear off, he reasoned. But he wondered if it would. He stopped smiling. In the glass, he saw a gray man, gray clothes, gray skin. There was no surplus of fat on the hard, bitter face. The eyes were pointed and bright as the chipped diamond of his needle. The nose and chin were almost excessively firm. The high forehead leading up to the tawny, close-cropped curls redeemed the face somewhat. He tried to smile, and the bitterness vanished. He made a mental note of that phenomenon. Maybe I've just grown up, he offered. Maybe, grunted Bo, and climbed back up into his berth. Gumbo reached under his mattress and pulled out an old magazine. It fell open naturally to a full-page portrait of a man. Gumbo took it over to the mirror and compared the portrait with his own image, as he had 100 times in the past. Except for a certain dissolute quality and a difference in ages, the picture might have been of his own face. It was not. He tore out the page, shredded it methodically, and flushed it down the toilet. After that, he stretched out in his bunk. Call me up at 11:30, he called up to Bo, so I'll have time to say goodbye. In the new cell blocks, the doors were made of steel bars, opened by a central control. But here in the old block, the panels were solid iron, each with its own old-fashioned lock. When Gumbo had first cooked up his scheme for escape nearly 8 months ago, he had wrangled a transfer to this old block. Now his plans had matured, and he was set for the crush-out. It was no trouble to pry away the disc he had cut into the floor, and picking the lock was a cinch. The wrench came when he had to say goodbye to Bo. Gumbo was surprised how deep was his affection for the old forger. Damned if his eyes didn't smart when they shook hands. Both knew it was for the last time. Gumbo was on a one-way junket. Either he'd cut it, or he'd wind up in the morgue. Gumbo waited until the new guard passed along the catwalk on his first round, then eased himself into the corridor. 100 convicts could see him, yet that gave him no worry. None of them would dare raise an alarm. A rat wouldn't last 48 hours in San Jacinto. He paused a moment, and the corridor was so quiet it startled him. He saw Bo's pallid face watching him from the small circular opening in the cell door. He smiled and paddled on his way. He scrambled to the roof of the old block and, as expected, found a skylight ajar. That deal had cost Gumbo a 6-month supply of tobacco. Cheap enough. There was a fog outside, but not as much as he had prayed for. Well, he couldn't turn back now, even if he wanted to. He edged along the roof and lay belly flat until a car drove up outside the main gate and honked to attract the tower bull. Some guard coming home from a double-billed show in the city. Gumbo set his jaw. Someday soon, he'd be going to city shows, if luck held. He chose the moment to drop off the roof and dart across the open space to the shadows of the high stone wall. He crouched there, staring up. The top of the wall was brightly illuminated by floodlights, broken by darkened towers where the gun guard sat with 30-30s cocked. Gumbo hated them, hated more the thing they stood for. 8 hours daily, year in and year out, they waited like tireless cats, tensed for the moment when some foolhardy con would try for the wall. Gumbo had his own grudges, but he couldn't imagine sitting for years waiting to kill a man he didn't even know. But that wall had to be scaled. There was no other out. Gumbo cursed the gun bulls thoroughly, and the outburst relieved his tension. For 4 years he had been studying this wall, and he knew his spot. He removed his shoes, and with a broken file chiseled out enough mortar for a toehold. That took him the better part of an hour before he worked up to where he could reach the rim with his hands. He clung there a moment, dreading to run the gauntlet. The old Gumbo had come back to haunt him, the wide-eyed kid that Bo had spoken about. He was scared. Then the new Gumbo, recreated by 4 years of hell, took over. He gave a growl that was a half prayer, half oath, and heaved himself into the light. In the silence, the crash of the rifle was stunning. An unseen hand seemed to pluck at Gumbo's shirt and nearly jerked him back into the prison yard. The light blinded him so that he couldn't see the swirling black waters below. Momentarily, he lost his sense of direction. Then he bent his knees and precipitated his body into space. The rifles barked twice more before the water took him in. The cold of it knocked the breath out of him, but he stayed under until his lungs could stand no more. When he surfaced, the sirens were screaming. Inquisitive fingers of lights laid a pattern on the water, searching for him. He submerged hastily, swimming with long, cautious strokes so as not to mar the black surface. Somehow he started to think of Bo Jenkins, sitting back there in his cell, haunted by the sounds of siren and barking guns. Bo would be taking it worse than Gumbo. Much worse. A good guy, Bo. Gumbo would never forget him, if he lived to remember anything. Bo had taught him 1,000 tricks of forgery in the endless hours of their confinement, because it was a necessary facet in the bright diamond of Gumbo's plan. But it was well that Bo had stayed. He couldn't have made that wall. Bo had been locked up too long, and now his only interest lay in the stories of girls gone wrong. The powerful currents were sweeping Gumbo towards the point. The tower guards knew that. Their spotlight set the water on fire, and a machine gun beat a tireless tattoo. But Danny Gumbo knew about that current too, and instead of fighting it as the others had before him, he swam with it, working in close to the wall. Neither the spotlights nor the machine guns could be depressed enough to reach him there. He smiled bitterly. That's what planning could do for a man. The siren died away, as if tired, then began to shriek again in a rising crescendo. Gumbo spent the balance of the night and the following day in the hold of an ancient schooner, long abandoned on the mudflats. Twice a police launch came by, but did not stop. In the late afternoon, the sun edged through the fog, making it warm without too much visibility. Gumbo stripped, and while his clothes were drying on the rotting deck, he ate a few of the shellfish he found clinging to the hulk. The fresh water contained in them revived him. When the sun disappeared beyond the gate, he slid into the water and struck out on the long haul to the mainland. When he finally reached Valencia, he crawled under a fishing pier. Resting there, he heard the steam whistle of a factory plant mark the end of the swing shift. Midnight. Gumbo grinned. He'd been free just 24 hours, and the first hurdle was over. He stayed hidden until the workers cleared off the streets, and when at last the old town settled down, he made his way up the main drag. The sight of so many young men in uniform surprised him, and twice he passed little groups on shore patrols. He had a sudden desire to get into the army, to bury himself among the millions in the comforting nonentity of a uniform, but a moment's reflection told him that was not for him. His fingerprints would land him back in prison. In the Swiss-Italian section of town, he found an old second-hand store. The rear door gave him no trouble, and he traded his sodden prison garb for a nondescript brown suit and a pair of worn tennis shoes. He stumbled over an old crutch, which gave him an idea, and when he made the highway, it won him a ride on a fruit truck bound for Los Lobos. The driver was a good little guy who had recently come out of Arkansas. He was talkative, so Gumbo let him ramble without paying too much attention. "We come out here to California to help win this war," the driver explained. "My wife's a riveter, my daughter's a guard, and my boy's in the Coast Guard. But me, they wouldn't give me no defense job." "Tough," muttered Gumbo. He wished he'd remember to steal a pack of smoke somewhere. He could have used a few drags. "Why?" babbled the driver, as if Gumbo had asked. "I don't mind telling you. I ain't ashamed. I done time, see? It's all over and done for, but still, they won't give me a job." Gumbo gave him a suspicious glance, but the poor boob was leveling. "Yes, sir, I done time. For peddling hooch. And, mister, it was good stuff, even if I do say it." He detailed his formula. "The best people was me customers, even the DA himself. The very guy what sent me up. I can't figure why they won't let me work in no defense plant." "Tough," Gumbo repeated. The man's whine was grating on his nerves. "Oh, hell, I don't care. This is a job anyhow. Say, bub, how far are you a-going?" "Well, you said you were going to Los Lobos." "Sure, but..." "Well, that's where I'm going." "Well, yeah, but..." "That's all of it," Gumbo cut him short. "Well, hell, I was just trying to be neighborly," grumbled the driver, aggrieved. It was a 13-mile walk to San Carlos, and Gumbo reached the outskirts by dawn. It was too late to do anything, so he spent the day in a culvert, alternately dozing and rehearsing his act. For the past year, he had mentally written and revised the script until it had seemed perfection itself. But now that the time had come for the first and only performance, he felt restless and uneasy. There would be no repeat. If he muffed his first chance, he was through. As it started to rain, Bo's warning came back to him. I know what it's like to be hunted. You lay in the rain, hungry and cold, scared of the sound of your own heart pounding. By dusk, the culvert began to flow, so Gumbo crawled into an orchard where he sat hunched and miserable until sometime after midnight. A small inner voice kept urging him to scram and hop a freight train east, any place away from San Carlos, but Gumbo stubbornly closed his mind against it. Gambling had got him into trouble in the first place, and he was determined to gamble on this one chance, a chance in a million, to come out on top. If the wheel of fate dealt him a double zero, he was set for life. If not, he'd take it without a squawk. So far, he had 2 full days of freedom. He shivered. Bo called the shots up till now. He half yearned for the comparative warmth of his old cell. Walking again, he felt better. The crutch was a damn nuisance, but a good blind. So accurate to say that there were 2 Gumbo he clung to it. Passing an alley, the smell of fresh coffee tantalized him to the point where he almost tried to panhandle a cup, but he resisted the impulse and continued across town. He came to the big house at last. His knees began to shake so hard, he really found use for the crutch. The house was dark, but Gumbo had expected that. He scrunched down behind the hedge to wait. He could afford to wait, now that he had reached his objective. His performance could not start until his audience had arrived. A little later, he heard a siren wail somewhere uptown. It gave him an unpleasant constriction in his diaphragm, even though he assured himself it couldn't be for him. San Carlos was the last place on earth the law would expect to find Gumbo Wire.